Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about the horror film Nomads on Blu-ray. Nomads came out in 1986, and it was written and directed by John McTiernan in his directorial debut. So John McTiernan is the guy who gave us the films Predator, Die Hard, The Hunt for October, Last Action Hero, Die Hard with a Vengeance, 13th Warrior, just to name a few. So he's definitely turned out some top-tier action films. But horror is a realm wherein, one wouldn't expect to find him, especially, say making his debut, because you compare the majority of his other films with Nomads, and Nomads stands out as an oddity. And I say that kind of in a good way because, whereas he has dabbled in the realm of horror with films like Predator and The 13th Warrior. I mean, of course, Predator being a sci-fi action horror film, and 13th Warrior being a historical fiction, action horror film. I mean, those two films weren't, say, distinctly horror films, whereas Nomads was a distinct horror film. And it definitely stands out in terms of, say, what one would expect from, say, 80s horror cinema. And I would say just in terms of, straight up atmosphere, I mean, it kind of made me think of, Hellraiser at times, or The Hunger, just based on, say, the lighting and, the visuals in terms of, say, the background and things like that. But it kind of made me think of Ridley Scott's fantasy film Legend as well, just in terms of, say, capturing, this, beautiful yet at times, terrifying dream, on screen. Except, of course, Legend is a straight-up fantasy film for adults, and Nomads is an urban ghost story, as it's often been described as. And so, but it definitely, captures that feeling of, filming a dream, and, you're walking the line between, waking up and, staying asleep, and, continuing to dream as things get, stranger and more deadly. But another thing that, has, Nomads, stand out, from other horror films of the 80s is that you have the composer Bill Conti, working with, the rock and roll guitar player Ted Nugent. So, I mean, Bill Conti, the guy who gave us the scores for films like Rocky and The Karate Kid, working with, Ted Nugent, the Motor City Madman, the guy who did, Cat Scratch Fever and Stranglehold. Not a union you would expect to come to fruition in the first place, let alone one to actually succeed. But it did happen, and it actually worked very well. I mean, Bill Conti and Ted Nugent, both, did wonderful work in this film. And it's something that at times the score is, soothing, and calming, but that's in some instances sort of lulling you into a false sense of security. But it's a sort of calming that comes from, say, you're being lulled into, a sense of relaxation, like you're about to fall asleep, but then, say the music will become a little more ominous. Now, whether that's strictly, on Bill Conti's, part, or say Ted Nugent's part, I mean, either way, the result is very memorable. And so it's like the music can go from, relaxing, to ominous, and to outright, oh shit just got real, kind of a feel. And so you also have Pierce Brosnan and Lesley-Anne Down, giving very good lead performances in this film. And so Pierce Brosnan, this was at a point in time when he was well known for the TV show Remington Steele, and he was excited to get the part, in this film, because it was very different from his work on that TV show. And he was wanting to kind of show his, range as an actor, besides being, sort of, a dapper, gentleman thief, and kind of like Neil Caffrey before Neil Caffrey from White Collar, and Lesley-Anne Down, she's known to a lot of people for being on the show The Bold and the Beautiful, and I vaguely remember watching some of those soap opera shows with my grandparents when I was a little kid, because I mean, hey, TV's on, you watch whatever's on the TV, right? So I know I vaguely remember seeing some episodes from that show when my grandparents were watching it, but I wouldn't be able to tell you anything about it though, But so apparently Lesley-Anne Down was very well known for being on that show. So I don't know if her work on the show was at the same time as her work on Nomads, but it's interesting how you have two actors who were in one way or another very recognizable due to being on well-known TV shows. And so in the case of them being in Nomads, it was an opportunity for them both to be in something very different from their usual work. And so Nomads, though, it was actually based on a novel by a writer named Chelsea Quinn Yarboro. And not that long ago, I actually had the privilege of being able to find and read the novel. Basically, I was very lucky in the sense that I found it online, and I had this mother of an Amazon gift card, and so I didn't have to spend an arm and a leg to get it, because it's actually pretty hard to find these days. And so it wasn't my own money, it was Amazon gift card, right? One of the perks of my old job. But anyway, so that's how I got the opportunity to read the novel Nomads. And so, the novel and the movie more or less tell the same story, but there are enough differences to make them both, stand out from each other. And so I think, of course, in some instances the novel was better, and in some instances the movie was better. So like the movie, of course, is a very visual medium, and for the type of atmosphere that the story is trying to convey, I think that with respect to Chelsea Quinn Yarboro's work on the novel, I think the movie definitely did a much better job of conveying the sort of urban ghost story atmosphere that the story was going for. But on the other hand, and of course, you also have the aforementioned score by Bill Conti and Ted Nugent helping things out. But on the other hand, though, when it comes to, say, the character development of the protagonists, as well as, say, a little bit more of the background on the supernatural antagonists, I think that the novel did a better job. So, but that's not to slight the movie in any way, or to slight the book in any way either, because they're both, good works. It's just, one's a book and one's a movie. So you be the judge. But yeah, so I had seen a couple of clips from the movie a few years ago on YouTube, and it looked interesting. I mean, and of course, I also read some articles on it a while back. One of those books I remember reading was something along the lines of the scariest films you've never seen, and Nomads was one of those films. And so I'm not going to say Nomads is one of the scariest films you've never seen, but it's definitely an original horror film. And so I was very glad to finally be able to see the movie. And I just wish that the film had done better at the box office than it did, because I don't know what the budget was, but it only made somewhere between $2 and $3 million, and so it didn't do that well. And a lot of the reviews were really not kind to the film when it came out. And sometimes what happens is if you have a horror film, critics probably aren't going to be kind to it for the most part. But then fast forward 10 or 20 years later, the film's reevaluated, and people are like, hey, this is actually a good movie. The critics were just being snooty. And so Nomads was definitely one of those films, because 10 or 20 years after it came out, I mean, people were trying to find it, because apparently it was difficult to get a hold of. And so finally with Blu-ray it's easier for people to see. And so I imagine for those who saw it in the theater but hadn't seen it since, I mean, this will be a treat to kind of go down memory lane to see the movie on Blu-ray. But for those of us who, were either not born yet or had only just been born when it came out, yeah, it's definitely kind of a snapshot of the urban reality of the 1980s, especially say Los Angeles, because I've never been in Los Angeles, but it was filmed in Los Angeles, so you kind of have an idea of what the environment's like there. But then again, it's not just a snapshot of urban 80s reality, but it's also an urban ghost story too. So definitely a unique viewing experience. So let's go ahead and get into it. So the movie kicks off with the character of Dr. Eileen Flax, played by Lesley-Anne, and she's just come off of 30-hour or so stretch at the hospital that she works at, when she gets a call that they've brought in a new patient and they need her assistance. And so she goes to see what's going on, and they bring in this guy who's covered in blood and raving incoherently, and so they're telling her that the police found him wandering and raving. And when they checked him out, they said that I mean, there's all this blood on him, but there's only a few cuts on him. I mean, nothing to account for, but nothing that should have resulted in, say, the amount of blood that they found on him. And so they're very perplexed. So it's like, where did it all come from? I mean, surely, just based on these, relatively, small cuts and abrasions, I mean, the guy's clearly, been through the ringer, but not to a point where, he's bleeding. He should be bleeding buckets. And so, they're kind of short-staffed at the moment, on that particular night. Like the main doctor's, away. And so basically, she's one of the main doctors that's available to take the call. And so she's checking him out and seeing what's going on. And because she also realizes that, in his ravings and rantings, he's speaking French. Now, she's not fluent in French, but, she knows French when she hears it, though. And so, she's trying to, calm him down and get him to relax so she can examine him. And, she has this little, medical flashlight that she's, using to examine his eyes. And then, he suddenly lashes out at her. And mind you, he's handcuffed to, the railing on the hospital bed that he's in. And he's strong enough to, I mean, in this moment, he's able to basically, break the railing, that he's handcuffed to, and, grab onto her. And, the hospital bed sort of, falls over, with the two of them. And he's, whispering something to her. And then he bites her, sort of around the ear. Not like a Mike Tyson bite, but it's like somewhere like around in this area. But, she ends up becoming, unconscious, from the whole experience. And then when she comes to, she, vaguely remembers, seeing something like, someone else's, memories. But then, the doctors are telling her that, hey, that guy, he's dead. And so, she's just like, what the hell just happened? And, one of her colleagues is asking her, what'd he say to you? And so she, says, she tells him that, the guy didn't say anything. And, the guy's all like, well, it's a pity because, a man's last words, should, ought to mean something. But since, he was speaking French and what have you, she couldn't understand what he was saying, but she sort of white lied and said that she didn't, catch the words he was saying. So, going from there, she asks a friend of hers, another medical colleague named Cassie, who, is somewhat more familiar with French than she is, like to a sense that, in a sense that she could actually translate, some words. And so when she's telling Cassie, what this guy was saying, Cassie, is saying, okay, well, it sounds like, they're not there, they're not there, they're Inuit, and so she doesn't know what that word means, and said maybe it's a place or something. And so then one of her other colleagues that she had talked to earlier comes and informs them that the guy who died, the one who was ranting and raving and speaking French, a couple of interesting things about him. One, he was a French anthropologist named Jean Pommier, played by Pierce Brosnan, who had just come to the States with his wife. Sorry, give me a moment here. Veronique. And so the two of them had come stateside, so that Jean could start his new job as a teacher at one of the local universities, and he was going to be teaching anthropology classes because he and his wife, they basically been traveling all over the world, studying nomadic cultures, and so basically they just wanted to kind of settle down and be, I guess you could say, everyday normal people, and just use their life experiences to teach people about what nomadic cultures are like, and just along with, say, anthropology in general. But along with this knowledge, and just with this revelation that this guy is a relatively well-known individual, they also found out that his body tested negative for, say, any signs of drugs. His adrenaline was up, but there were no signs of, say, cocaine or PCP or anything like that. And so, something, got, Jean Pommier, worked up enough to where he, basically, scared himself to death, more or less. But going from there, though, Eileen, she starts to, find herself going from, say, her perspective and her reality to suddenly reliving Jean Pommier's memories, and within the days and leading up to his death. So it's like she starts remembering when he and his wife first arrived in America and bought a home, and them trying to settle in. But in the process, though, they come to realize that the home that they've just bought and are trying to settle into has become sort of a shrine of some sort to this wandering group of nomadic street punks, and or at least that's what they seem to be. And they keep like leaving this graffiti, like stuff about killing, written on the garage doors, and somehow, like, they had been able to get inside of the house, prior to their arrival, and because they find newspaper clippings with blood on them, and or at least Jean Pommier does initially, and he tries to keep them from his wife because he doesn't want to freak her out, but he's wondering in these memories that Eileen's having, Jean, became obsessed with these, street punks, because, you know, he's wondering, what, kind of people, would, make a shrine, to say a place of murder, or a place that had murder in its past, because apparently the house was the scene of a violent crime at some point. And so, that was one of the reasons why apparently you get the idea that, the original owners, hightailed it out of there, or something else happened to them relating to that. But Jean Pommier, though, he starts to, when he sees these punks again, they're driving around in this, black van that's always, blaring this sort of, hard rock and, heavy metal music, in all hours of the night or day even. Jean Pommier decides to, follow them. His anthropology, instincts are kicking in, because, here's this, wandering group of, nomads in, everyday urban LA. And, he thought that, they had left nomads behind, in the far reaches of the world, he and his wife, but, here he is with an opportunity, to, learn about, urban nomads, albeit ones that are, drawn to, say, some, twisted backgrounds. And so he starts following them, he starts driving and following them, following their van and taking notes. And, he goes, he tells them to, one end of the city to another. And, they never seem to stop. They never seem to sleep. They'll stop to eat somewhere maybe, or grab supplies, but they just keep moving. They, for something like 30 hours straight, they do not sleep at all. And so, he's like, what's going on here? Because, he also witnesses, them commit some violent crimes as well. And he tells his wife, when he finally gets home and tells her, what he's seen, she's, wondering, has he, gone mad or something? Because, here he is, here they are trying to settle down, and they're going to be starting their, and he's going to be starting his, work as a teacher just in a couple of days. And here he is, gallivanting about, for a couple of days on end, following street punks. And so, he's trying to tell her that there's something about them. And he said that, there's a lot of stuff that, he recognizes from, say, their time abroad, like, certain traits that, are very consistent with nomadic cultures, but there's something about these individuals that stands out. In a sense that, one, they're nomads in an urban environment, which he had never seen before. And two, he's trying to understand, why they're so, fascinated by, their house, or why they're fascinated by scenes of violence or, death. And so, as Dr. Flax, or as Eileen, continues to, witness these memories, it plays havoc with her personal and professional life, because one minute she'll be, in the real world and talking to someone or walking around, and then suddenly she'll be, struck by a memory of Pommier's. And so somehow or another, when Pommier, bit her and whispered whatever it was he whispered to her, he transferred, his memories into her mind. And so that way, she's, able to, see what happened to him leading up to his death, and they come to find that, or she, through Pommier's memories, comes to learn that these street punks that Pommier was tailing are in fact evil spirits from an Inuit, culture, or I should say the Inuit culture, like the Eskimos, and so they're trickster spirits, and they take the shape of humans, but anyone who falls in with them, anyone who travels with them or pursues them, inevitably falls, to insanity or, death or a violent death, because of the evil nature of these spirits. And so, um, you're caught between two stories here. You're caught between Eileen, trying to understand, exactly what happened to Pommier, and how, his experience, with these evil spirits, marked him for a violent end. And on the other hand, you're with Pommier when his memories are being relived, and we come to experience the dawning horror of his situation. It goes from fascination to horror. And so but yeah, I mean, this was a fascinating film, and definitely something that at times feels like it really does feel like a dream at times, in a sense that you're on the verge of waking up, but then you start having this strange dream again, which is basically what's happening with Eileen. And so I thought that both Lesley-Anne Down and Pierce Brosnan did good work in their roles. I think that Pierce Brosnan did a pretty good job with a French accent. I mean, I'm not French, I'm not a French expert, but his accent actually sounded pretty good, at least to me. And he does a good job of kind of playing a fish out of water, culturally speaking, in a sense that he's so used to being a nomad. I'm sorry, or he's so used to basically living with nomadic cultures. He with his wife, and so when he's coming to America with her, to basically live a sort of civilized life. It's something that he's trying to get accustomed to, but you can tell that he's sort of uneasy about the concept. And so when he has this opportunity to study a potentially new culture, he can't resist. It's just he didn't realize that by going after these people, that he was going to be drawing their attention. And not only were they people of evil intent, but they were also of inhuman origin. And so we definitely experience the transition from fascination to horror with Pommier's character. And I thought that Pierce Brosnan did a pretty good job of that, because I mean, there are moments where he's clearly fascinated by them, but then the more he sees of them, like in the violent acts that they commit, the more horrifying he becomes, the more horrified he becomes of them. And in the case of Lesley-Anne Down as Eileen Flax, or Dr. Eileen Flax, I thought that she did a pretty good job too. And even though, like, say, the lion's share of the acting goes to Pierce Brosnan, in a sense that we get more time with his character, I do like how Dr. Eileen Flax, she's, a figure of authority to some degree, and she likes to think that she has some measure of control over her life, at least in the medical profession. But you also get an idea, though, that her personal life, is something that's outside of her control. I mean, we get some dialogue about a marriage that didn't work out, and when we see her at her apartment, it's very Spartan, and there's not a lot of furniture there. Like she's in the process of moving in still, or maybe she got rid of a bunch of stuff, in the sense that she and her husband split, and maybe he took the majority of the stuff that was in their apartment. But then so we get an idea that she's lacking control in her personal life because of the divorce. But on the other hand, when it comes to her work in the medical profession, she has some measure of control. But then she meets Pommier, and when his memories transfer to hers, I mean, that's when she loses what little control that she has of her life. Because she'll be going about her day, doing her thing, and then suddenly she starts talking with the words that Pommier was saying in a conversation in his past, prior to his death. And so, other people are starting to, see this too. Like one minute she's talking to a nurse and basically giving her instructions, but then, the nurse asks her a question. And so she says something about the carpet will be fine. And it turns out she's actually reliving a conversation that Pommier had with his wife about their new home. And so, of course, since no one else is able to see any of Pommier's memories, but Eileen, I mean, she's definitely starting to come off as crazy. And so it gets to where, I mean, what little control she has over the situation, I mean, just breaks, and the memories just start to pull her strings, so to speak. Like, wherever Pommier went, Eileen goes. And so, any place that he followed the Nomads to, she feels compelled to go to that place because she's basically, living as him in those moments. And so it's a very strange feeling, going from, one person to the other, but it definitely, captures the feel of, a chaotic dream. As far as, say, like, the Nomads themselves, they're actually played by, a couple of, people who are, known in the music or art scene. I mean, you have Adam Ant, playing the leader of the Nomads, who's played, I mean, he's given the name of Number One. And so, at least in the credits, I mean, he's not named in the movie, but he's clearly, the leader of the group. And to see a musician like Adam Ant actually do, as good of a job as he is, at being spooky, even though he doesn't say anything, I mean, goes to show just, how good of an actor, Adam Ant is capable of being, even though he's definitely more well known as a musician, and a very good one at that. So it's definitely cool to see Adam Ant, not only have, a vital role in a horror film, but sort of a lead role, albeit as one of the, bad guys. And even though he doesn't say anything, I mean, he definitely makes an impression. Mary Woronov from Night of the Comet, she actually plays one of the Nomads as well, and she's listed in the credits as Dancing Mary, because there's this very memorable scene where while Pommier's tailing them, he finds them outside of this building, and this is at night, and they're sort of just rocking out to some music, and he's taking pictures of them, and they all make it clear that they can see him, even though he's trying to hide. And then, Number One, Adam Ant's character, just sort of, non-verbally, tells Dancing Mary, to go over, to Pommier. And so without saying anything, she sort of, saunters over to him and gets on top of the car that he was hiding behind and starts dancing on it. And this is when, the soundtrack really kicks into sort of, hard rock, because you have, Ted Nugent's guitar playing, and because with the music that they're listening to, suddenly you hear Ted Nugent's guitar playing, and it's like this really hard, blistering hard rock piece. And she just, works it for the camera, both, for the film camera, but also for Pommier's camera too. And she's just sort of posing and making these sort of, semi-lewd, gestures, but also just sort of, you know, portraying this almost animalistic, side, and it's a fascinating portrayal because, like Adam Anna's number one, Mary Woronov as Dancing Mary doesn't say anything, but she manages to make an impression though with her character, and so, and you also have, let's see, I mean, you have, you know, you have some other characters who, like, and it's interesting how they're named in the on the credits list, because there's one of them who's credited as Ponytail, and because I mean he's a big hulk of a dude, but he's got this ponytail, and he manages to be pretty spooky too, and like everyone else, all the other nomads, he doesn't say anything, but he conveys this simmering sense of menace, not just with his physical mannerisms, but just with how he looks at Pommier too. And so I mean, all the actors who played in Nomads, I mean Hector Mariado is the one who plays Ponytail, and a woman named Josie Cotton, she plays a nomad who's credited as Silver Ring, but she's the one that we see holding the radio whenever they're rocking out to it, and also she shows up wherever Pommier is at times. Like one night he's looking through some of the photos they took, and he sees her out of the corner of his eye, and he hears her laughing, but when he turns the lights on, there's no one there. And then at another point, he looks in the rear view mirror of his car, and he sees her there and hears her laugh, but there's no one there. And so I mean, she looks like a street punk or a punk rocker or something, but the way that she's filmed, I mean, just sort of adds to the horror aspect, in a sense that she definitely sells the idea that she's like an evil spirit of some sort, albeit one that's toying with her prey. And Frank Doubleday also shows up as one of the nomads, and he's credited as Razor, and I don't remember seeing like a razor on him, but I mean he, it's one of those things where it's like, if you know who Frank Doubleday is, like if you remember him from Escape from New York or Assault on Precinct 13, you see him as one of the nomads, you're like, hey, it's that guy, that kind of thing. So but yeah, the little pack of actors that played the nomads, I thought all did a good job, even though like they don't say anything, they just sort of let their bodies do the work, like through physical mannerisms, and they really do a good job of conveying this sense of otherworldly menace. And so, speaking of the supernatural stuff, I mean, it's like the majority of the horror, I mean, yes, it's coming from these nomads, and like their physical mannerisms, and the fact that 1 minute they're there and the next minute they're not at times, which definitely makes things creepy. But you also have this wonderful set piece where Pommier winds up in this abandoned church, and it's abandoned save for a single blind nun named Bertle, who's played by Frances Bay, who I know I've seen her in some stuff before, but she's a good actress. But she does a wonderful job in the brief amount of time that she's in the movie as the blind nun, and it's one of those things where Pommier's never met her before, and she's never met him, but she reveals some that she knows who he is, even though she's, one, blind, and two, she's never met him before, and vice versa. And she reveals a certain amount of knowledge about what's going on with them, about who they are and what have you. And one of the things that she says is that things collect. And when she says that, she's talking about, places where, violent calamities have happened, they draw things. And just over time, bad things collect there. And unfortunately, Pommier's new house was one of those places. And apparently, this abandoned church is as well, because while Bertel seems to be, a benevolent, other, otherworldly agent, like a divine agent, if you will, something bad, happened in the church at some point, because there's this ominous feel, you have, this whole place being abandoned, and the only lights coming from this lantern or this big flashlight, that Bertel's kind enough to give Pommier, and she has no need of it, and Pommier does. And so it's like whenever they're walking around the place together, the only light comes from maybe some of the light coming in from the windows outside it, but on the other hand, though, when the majority of the light's just coming from a solitary lantern, that's what they're calling it, it makes for a very eerie set piece. And then of course you have the bit where she keeps sort of looking over her shoulder after she tells him a little bit about what she knows about them and his situation, and she warns him to not fight them. She said, if you've never run from anything before, run from this, because they will take you to another world. And it's a pretty scary moment, because you just have these two actors talking with each other, but because of the atmosphere of the scene and of the setting in this abandoned church, there's this increasing sense of dread and menace. And mind you, the Nomads, we don't even see them show up in the church, but they clearly have enough of a presence to scare this nun who may or may not be a ghost herself. And so and you have this bit where after she directs Pommier to run, he does so, but he goes down this hallway and he sees these horrifying images of these demonic nuns coming right at him through the darkened hallways. And the way it's shot, it's like you see some of the nuns with disfigured faces, and some of them like they flash their breasts at him, but it's not done in a erotic way. It's done in a sort of perverted way, if that makes sense. But it's done so briefly, though, that with the lighting and everything, and the whole hallway being shadowed, it's hard to see all the details, but that something's wrong with these nuns. Like something happened at some point to turn a place that was once holy into a place where darkness and ghosts dwell. And so it's definitely one of the highlights of the movie, as far as like set pieces go. And even people who didn't like the movie, they singled that particular scene out as probably the standout scene of the movie, in terms of, say, capturing the idea of someone walking between two worlds and falling into one, like say someone in the real world catching a glimpse of another dark world, but because they've seen it, the dark world has seen them too, and they're falling into it further and further the more they pursue it. And so that particular scene, I thought, did a good job, because it was like, in a way, it felt like a safe space in a video game, because Pommier's given a chance to rest from what's going on, but at the same time, though, it's further enforced that, this isn't something that, he can handle by himself. This is something that if he wants any hope of surviving, he literally has to run. Like he has to, take his wife and, they basically have to start all over again and just away from Los Angeles. But unfortunately, though, at this point, it may be too late, because he spent so much time, chasing these spirits that, they know who he is now. And they also know who his wife is, too. And so, speaking of his wife, the actress Anna Maria Monticelli, I hope I'm saying her name right. She does a good job of playing Jean Pommier's wife, Veronique. And I'm trying to remember if I'd seen her in something before, but she was speaking French too, and I think she actually is French. I could be mistaken on that, but I think she actually was French. So, I mean, when she and Pommier are, at their home together speaking, in French, I mean, there's definitely a sense of chemistry there. And Pommier is sort of, trying to, encourage her to, speak English since they're in America now. And so, there were some funny scenes where, like they're flirting or just, relaxing. And so she, reluctantly, says a few words in, English, but she has too much fun speaking, in French and teasing her husband. But when she does speak English, she does it very well. And like in the scenes where, she's, when she finally meets Eileen, you have a sort of, convergence of, storylines here when the two of them finally meet. And so, you have Lesley-Anne Down, playing Eileen, but with having experienced Palmier's memories, and so it's like she'll be saying stuff that, Pierce Brosnan's character had said to Veronique, and Anna Maria Monticelli, I mean, she's, having to, play a woman who is distraught from having recently lost her husband, but from also hearing and witnessing this strange woman, talk exactly like her husband, at least in terms of, say, the words she says. And so it's like she's trying to figure out how the hell can this woman who I've never even met before, how can she know so much about my husband? And so, she, definitely comes to realize, though, that, her husband was not crazy. Like, there actually was something that he got involved in that, came after him, once, she, comes to understand, what's happening with Eileen. And so, but yeah, I thought that Nomads was a good movie. I thought that, it was a very, dreamlike, movie, and also a good, urban ghost story, like, it's often been described as. And, it's not the scariest movie I've ever seen, but there is, a unique direction that they go, within, the realm of horror in this movie. And, I liked the idea of, both the characters of Eileen and John, being in the real world, but becoming aware of this darker, underworld, like this dark side, to reality that, once they see it, I mean, they can't unsee it. Like they have to pursue it, regardless of, what those in this dark world, feel, for humanity. And so, I mean, in Eileen's case, it's more because, Pommier's memories are rolling around inside her head and sort of taking her over and forcing her to relive his final days. But in Pommier's case, it's his wandering instincts, taking over. And so I thought like that's an instance where the book did a much better job of explaining why he's so determined to go after these nomads, even though there's clearly something wrong with them. And, basically the book goes out of its way to, tell you about his life and everything, and you kind of understand, why he just can't sit still, like why he always has to be on the move, even though he knows his wife, wants to settle down and everything, and he wants to make her happy. But, the minute he's given an excuse, he just wanders, as in he pursues, something that's a mystery. And so we see some of that in the movie, but I just thought that the book did a better job. And I think that the movie did a good enough job explaining why Pommier would go after them, but there are moments where I felt like, for those who like their storytelling a little more linear, I feel like they might have a hard time swallowing the fact that, a grown man would be, pursuing these, clearly malevolent individuals of his own free will. And so it's kind of like, on one hand, you get the idea that they might be exerting some sort of pull on him, but on the other hand, though, because of his restless nature, he's being given an opportunity to see something new. And so personally, I thought it worked out rather well. They did a better job of, explaining it in the book, but the movie, if you go by, say, visual logic and what you're seeing on screen, you can kind of, put the pieces together to come up with, a good explanation as to why he would do that. As far as, say, like, the back and forth, between Pommier and Eileen, I thought both actors did a good job in their parts, Pierce Brosnan and Lesley-Anne Down, respectively. But I do think, though, that while Lesley-Anne Down, she does, get some time to shine, like more towards, say, the third act of the movie. I do feel like, though, that she's kind of sidelined, at the expense of, say, her character development, because Pierce Brosnan's, character is the one who's getting, the majority of the limelight, because it's his memories that we're reliving through Eileen and her experience. And so as a result, I think Pommier comes across as a far more fascinating character, courtesy of Pierce Brosnan's performance, as well as the fact that we get more time with him. Whereas with Lesley-Anne Down, though, she does a good enough job with, the stuff that she has to work with. She does a good job of playing a traumatized woman, in a horrifying situation rather well, and she does a good job of sort of playing a sort of a puppeteered individual, because she's clearly at the whims of Pommier's memories and not in control of herself. And so I thought that she did a good job in that regard. But it was only, I think, towards, say, the end of the movie where we really see her as a fully fleshed out character, and it's after she's been traumatized by reliving Pommier's memories. And so when she's with Veronique, and able to decompress, that's when, like, we see her, her trying to reassert some control of the situation, but she's not out of the woods yet because she's still at the mercy of Pommier's memories. But the attacks seem to soften once she reaches Pommier's wife Veronique. And so yeah, I did have a little bit of mixed feelings as far as, say, the back and forth nature of the film in terms of the perspectives, but at the same time, though, I think that both actors did a good enough job with their parts to where I mean, the back and forth, nature, while it might throw one for a loop for a bit, it wasn't a huge, problem, if any problem, to speak of. Um, I do think that with the Nomads, the Inuit, I think that, as I mentioned, all the actors who played them did a good job in their parts. They did a good job of, selling this, malevolent, you know, gang that has a sort of, otherworldly feel to them. But unfortunately, though, they never look like, something supernatural. Like, you look at the cover art here, there's, I mean, as awesome as this cover is, none of the, nomads look like that. Like, there's never a moment where, they suddenly, their faces shift or change or something like that, or their claw, or suddenly they grow claws or something. But I think that, excuse me, sorry. I mean, you do have that scene in the church where you see those monstrous nuns, running through the corridor. I mean, it's a cool scene and everything, but at the same time, I mean, considering the nomads are the main threat of the film, I think that it would have been better if we'd gotten a scene or two where, there's like maybe a glamour failure and Pommier or Eileen suddenly, sees, the nomads as they quote unquote really were, like what their spirits, looked like. But unfortunately, though, I mean, beyond this, cool cover art, I mean, we never see the nomads themselves like this. They look like an evil, goth street gang. Like if you, ever went to the church back in the day, the goth club, you probably have an idea of, what I'm talking about in terms of, say, this tribal, look to them, but with this, goth aesthetic. But and once again, they do a good job playing the parts as this gang of evil nomads. But I just wish that we could have gotten to see some monstrous forms of them. So, but and this being the '80s, I mean, it would have been cool, like maybe like a Rick Baker or Rob Bottin, makeup moment, or hell, even a John Carl Buechler moment. I mean, like as far as say like makeup, not like transforming necessarily, but just say like maybe a flash and suddenly you see them for just a little bit like what they really look like. That would have been cool, but unfortunately we don't really get that. So I think that all in all, I thought it was a good movie. It was definitely an original one. And I honestly wish that, I mean, with respect to John McTiernan's work on Predator and Die Hard, which are both awesome movies and two of the best ones ever made, I do wish that John McTiernan had made more films like this because, as far as writing goes, I mean, he actually did a pretty good job with the screenplay, and, he did a good job, with, characterizing, the individuals, that are going through all this, to where it's like we care about what's going on, regardless of how bizarre the situation is. But for the most part, though, I mean, I think that he didn't, if I remember correctly, I don't think he wrote and directed, anything else. I think he just stuck to directing afterwards. But I mean, I wish that he had, done more films like this. I mean, not say exactly like Nomads, but just say something that was another work of atmospheric horror that he wrote and directed, because he clearly had a knack for some writing too. But yeah, I forgot to mention one of the other actors that shows up is let's see, Alan Autry from the Heat of the Night TV show and the movie Southern Comfort. But he's one of Eileen's medical colleagues, and so he has some good lines of dialogue. And also the actors who played Cassie, Eileen's friend, the actress who played Cassie was Jeannie Elias. I hope I'm saying her last name right, but she did a good job of playing Cassie as someone who was sort of a spunky individual, but who was a sort of ride or die friend of Eileen's, and so I liked seeing the way their friendship was portrayed. And Cassie's actually the one who is able to do some detective work on Eileen's behalf, and she's the one who, through her interaction with, say, a university friend of Eileen's, we get the information about what the Nomads are. And so when Cassie is getting this information, I thought that Jeannie Elias did a good job of selling her character's confusion at what she's hearing. She's like, evil spirits, what the hell? This is like that kind of thing. Like, she was trying to help her friend out and understand what's going on with her friend, because the medical people who are examining Eileen are baffled because they've tried to, understand what's going on with her, because it's like the medical scans that they have, like the stuff that they got on her brain. It's like it's showing that she's got the brain patterns of someone who's wide awake, even though she's clearly not exactly awake. And so when Cassie's trying to understand what's going on, I thought that Jeannie Elias did a good job of playing that confusion for the character. So those are some other good performances, though, I forgot to mention. But yeah, all in all, though, I thought that this was a good movie. And I think that as far as like bonus features go, yeah, you have like 2 interviews, one with actress Lesley-Anne Down and composer Bill Conti, and you also have a theatrical trailer and a radio spot and a photo gallery. So, I mean, it's not a bad set of bonus features, but at the same time, I wish there'd been a little more, considering this was John McTiernan's first movie. But all in all, though, I thought that this was, a good movie. I'll go ahead and give Nomads 4 out of 5 stars. Yeah, this was a good one. I do think that the Blu-ray itself could have been improved with some more bonus material. But what we got is good enough. I mean, Lesley-Anne Down and Bill Conti both give good interviews, and so we get some insight into who they are as people, as well as their involvement with the film. So there you go. But yeah, that was Nomads. 4 out of 5 stars. So if you've made it this far and you like what you see, thank you very much, and please feel free to like and subscribe. And if you got any questions, comments, please drop a line and let me know. So y'all take care. Have a good night. Bye.